through it real fast. I am recording. So if you do not mind, please put your, if you're not asking questions or making comments, please put your phone on mute. We do not want feedback. And if I hear anybody in the background, I'll go through and I'll mute people as we go along. Jean Ritter is our presenter today for our RDS training. And today's training is centered around campus responsibilities, exceptions, and tracking. He does allow you to ask questions as he goes, so you can do that either by unmuting yourself or by putting your questions into the chat box, with which time I will read them back to him and he can respond. What else? I think that is it. It is now, again, now recording, so please feel free to ask questions and put everything on mute. Jean, is there anything else you need for them to know before we get started? Also, Mr.
Yep.
Okay,
The
Mr. Ritter,
documents.
I was going to say that Mr. Ritter did provide me the documents, so I'm going to email those documents to you now as he presents, so you have access to them, okay? And if your staff members are not on the email, please make sure you forward those attachments to them. So, Mr. Ritter, I will land things over to you.
All right, thank you, sir. Let me get this pulled up.
Okay.
Just a second here. And all right, is everyone seeing that now? Yes, no?
I do not see it yet. I see, well, what I see is.
All right, hold on.
Your screen. Yeah, I see your screen.
Okay.
52.
All right, trying to think what's going on. So you don't see it. All right, hold on. Try again.
I don't see anything yet.
Okay, how about now?
Yes, see the presentation.
All right.
All right.
Here we go. So good afternoon. This is part 2 in our series. Last time we kind of went through some just basics, especially for new folks, review, and then some recent changes. This time we're going to go through a more in-depth for folks that deal especially with campus-based exceptions and tracking a limited number of students that need to be tracked. So these represent a lot of the questions that really come to us. So I'm going to give a quick summary of all this and direct you to details. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's handled by RDS, because a couple exceptions are, which ones are handled by the campus. In particular, I'm going to talk about military veterans. That's one of the biggest questions, or most frequent questions I get is about veterans exceptions, other exceptions, and then what needs to be tracked and what doesn't. So there are 2 official publications from our end. Is the guidebook. That's the official document we use. That's the official document that the RDS processing team uses. It references statute in terms of the requirements and so forth. That's a public document. That's on our public website, so it's available to everyone, including students, parents. The second one that I revised back in July is for internal use only for campuses. This gets into some of the codes you need, and it gets into the campus-based exceptions. It defines them. It walks you through step by step what the requirements are, what documents you should look for, and so forth. So we're going to talk about a lot of the content of that. I've expanded it the last couple times to provide you with information based on frequent questions I get. So there's contact information, there's charts with the codes or messages on there. So it's a good resource for any time you have a campus exception. So the important distinction here is a residency determination by law can only be made by RDS. So this is an important distinction that may help you in understanding the tuition exceptions, because there are some tuition exceptions based on law, but it doesn't change their residency. So that's why you see sometimes a student gets what we call out in. For example, active duty military, stationed in North Carolina. If they're not claiming North Carolina as their permanent residence, they're not a resident, but it can give them in-state tuition. And that's an important distinction because, for example, there's a different statute that talks about state grants. They've got to meet the requirements. So it doesn't waive the normal requirements, it just gives a tuition exception. So RDS provides all of those, and that same determination is used for state grant eligibility. So when RDS makes a determination, it goes pretty much in real time out to the server that you all pull from. At the same time, it goes to the state grants portal. RDS is also responsible for evaluating immigration statuses. So that's something that we'll take care of. You don't need to worry about that. We'll talk about some tracking a little later on. Sometimes I get questions from campuses saying, well, but this person, you know, they're a ward of the state, or they're this, or they're split family. Can I make an exception? Well, no, you can't. But there are things set up in the interview that if they tell RDS, these do affect residency. So someone who was orphaned, let's say they're 17, you know, there's other family here, but the court's not going to appoint a legal guardian at that point. You know, there is no living parent, you know, there's provisions for that. So RDS does screen for all of these things. Now, there's one type of tuition exception that, in two different categories, that RDS will handle. And the reason is that they do not require anything else, okay? Some of the exceptions we're going to see, there's a time limit, or they have to be using, as in the case of veterans, if it's a non-resident, they have to use a benefit. These do not. So active duty military stationed in North Carolina and their eligible family, or an active member of the North Carolina National Guard. RDS first screens to see, are they a North Carolina resident? If they are, done. You don't need an exception. You don't need to worry about tracking it. But if they are claiming another state or live in another state, in the case of National Guard, they're eligible for that out-in. They don't have to use a benefit, and it's not for a predefined period of time. It's as long as they have that affiliation. RDS also, because this question has come up, is responsible for validating and collecting any documentation for all of its determinations. So you don't have to have the student bring all that stuff in unless it's needed for some other reason, okay? Only if you're giving a campus-based like tuition exception. You need to keep that documentation on file in case of audit because you're doing something to override the official determination. So the campus then, if you look at campus roles, this kind of summarizes them. And again, you're going to get a copy of this presentation, and the campus responsibility guide goes through it as well. But just a quick overview is anything that's campus-based, you know, you would have to review the eligibility. RDS can't for those other campus-based exceptions because they're tied to other requirements. Some of them, for example, there's a time limit. It has to be within 12 months of high school graduation. We don't know if they're going to enroll in 12 months, you know, things like that. Okay. If they have time limited eligibility of those, you've got to track that for those exceptions. And we're going to come back into this more detail a little later on. If there's a few cases where because of their immigration statuses, it's time limited, you've got to check, and we pass on what the expiration date is. You know, we have to see if they've been renewed. Statutory grace period, we're going to talk about the student who's had a change in status and you become aware of it, and collect documentation of any exceptions that you've granted. Regarding that change in status, this question has come up before about if you become aware that the student has had a change, you have no obligation to go out there every year and have them bring stuff in and prove they're still here. But let's say the student comes in, puts in a change of address and saying, our family just moved to Virginia. Okay, you're aware of something now, and we'll talk about how to handle that on a grace period that might give them up to a year's extension. But at that point, you have an obligation. But there's no obligation to be proactive and, you know, run after students. But if you become aware of it.
I mean, if it's in there.
Okay, so I'm going to go through this one kind of quickly. Active duty, again, these are determined by RDS, but I do get questions about them. So these exceptions, again, since they don't require any, they don't have to use any kind of financial aid, they don't have to have other criteria, it's just simply that the ones that are not residing here, okay, they're not claiming, I'm sorry, not claiming North Carolina as their permanent residence, but they're stationed here, they can get this award. The campus just simply needs to monitor for long term. We're going to come back to this in tracking because the student can actually keep it as long as they're continuously enrolled in their program, even if that service member gets transferred. We'll come back to that. All right. So basically the requirements are, and RDS is always going to screen first for these people to see, can they meet US or North Carolina requirements? We honor whatever they have on file with the military. If they're saying it's North Carolina, they're North Carolina, the student's good to go, even if that person's not stationed here or physically present here. If they're claiming another state and give us orders showing they're stationed here, then that opens it up so long as if the student's a spouse or dependent, so long as they're here with them. They're not living in another state and trying to apply, let's say, to go to one of the universities. And again, usually they're not going to get a state grant of that. It's giving a tuition exception. Generally, we've got to meet eligibility requirements. That person must be stationed here the first day of the term. There was a new provision signed into law a year ago that if a student gets admitted to your college with that out in while they're a senior in high school, and the service member gets transferred before they start classes, they can still keep it as long as they enroll the fall right after their high school graduation. So that provision is a recent one. And as long as they're continuously enrolled the same program, they're okay at the same institution. So generally, you know, that's, I think most people aren't going to worry about if you have a change of major, but they graduate from, let's say, an AAS program, and then they decide they want to, you know, it's usually another admission process, apply for another degree. Or the universities, they graduate from their bachelor's and now they're applying to grad school. At that time, it's got to be reevaluated. So in other words, the provision is there to help them finish their program, but it's not meant to be forever, you know, for other degree programs. Again, we handle this here. All right. So again, if the person's active duty here in North Carolina, but they're claiming North Carolina is their permanent residence on their documentation with the military, there's no waiver. You don't need to worry about tracking them just because they're active duty. It's only the ones for exceptions. North Carolina National Guard has something similar, but a little bit different. This refers to drilling members. These are the people that go, you know, like 1 week in a month, and they go, you know, for a week or two every year. And they're, you know, kind of in a ready status when needed. So this exception, there's actually very few of our students in the National Guard use the exception because, again, most of them have been here, they meet the residency requirements, there's no need to track. This only refers to people that are non-residents who can get an exception. It does not extend, unlike the active duty military, to a spouse or family member, unless that Guard member is placed on full active duty status in North Carolina. So as I say, in practice, you don't need an exception. The very few that we would have would be receiving that out in determination and get an NCNG flag. And most of them, honestly, I mean, since we've gone live, I think I saw there were like 20 some that came through like that. Most of them, for example, live just outside of Charlotte in South Carolina or just across the Virginia border. Charlotte has an Air National Guard unit. There aren't that many of those around. There's clearly National Guard in units in South Carolina that are closer, but because of that, or if they just recently moved here and hadn't met the 12-month requirement. But there's very few that need tracking. It's the same thing. Just because they're in the National Guard doesn't mean they need to be tracked. There's very few of these, but if you see that with a tracking flag and that out in, we would, that's a hint to that, and there's a tracking date. So we talked about this. All right. Get questions sometimes about reserve units other than the North Carolina National Guard. There is no provision in statute for them. They specifically must be a member of the North Carolina National Guard. Otherwise, they've got to meet the regular requirements. If, however, they go on active duty, like we've had folks from reserve in, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard so far come through, Marines, I think. Come through, but again, they've got to establish residency like anyone else according to the statute. So that's the ones that are kind of screened by RDS. So we're going to talk about ones that the campus has to deal with because they each have other requirements. I spend a little time with veterans because that's a frequent question. And I understand that because the VA, when there's educational benefits, are sticklers for audits and paperwork and making sure you're following all the rules. It requires to use this exception, and again, RDS is first going to screen. If they can meet the residency criteria, there's no need to track them for residency purposes. Financial aid is a different story, okay? But there's no need to track the exception. They don't need an exception. It's only the ones who can't meet the requirements, at least at this time, and they're going to have to use a benefit. So we screen it. There is no blanket provision in state law or federal law, for that matter, that gives someone an exception just because at one point, they were in the military. Like we do for active duty, there's no blanket exception. The tuition exceptions available for students who meet the criteria of the federal laws, the Veterans Choice Act, in terms of what types of benefits and so forth. Where there's often a misunderstanding is some people, including students, will assert, well, I'm a veteran or my family member was, therefore I automatically get it. No, it's if they have a benefit and use it and are awarded. Once again, it doesn't change their legal classification of resident. There would be non-resident. Okay. There are some limited provisions for state grants on this one, but most of it has to do with private institutions in the state law. Okay. If the student comes through as non-resident and they say they have a benefit they can use, RDS will flag that with an informational flag, a VEDEX or veterans exception. We have no way of knowing if they really do, and if so, have they used it up, or by the time they get to your institution, have they been somewhere else and used it up, or will they use it? Okay, but it's informational. Some colleges are proactive and run reports to identify them in advance to reach out. So to give an exception, it must be done for a term where they're receiving benefits. Okay. Someone who has one and elects not to use it is not eligible. We've had some go to the governor or anyone else, and the VA says, no, there's no requirement, only if they're using the benefit. So if they want to save them, or if they've used them up, or never had one assigned to them, there's no waiver. They're going to have to, establish that. However, once there's a benefit given per term, it must be adjusted by federal law. We had a student a couple of years back that had not used benefits for, I think it was at the university, like 3 semesters, changed her mind, went to the VA, and they awarded it retroactively. Well, because of the federal law that had to, and we usually don't do that, as you know, go back retroactive to previous terms, but it had to be adjusted. So this is one of the few times you would. So the intent is that they're establishing domicile in North Carolina, okay? So if you have someone like this and they've been there for a year or two, you might encourage them to go back to RDS and see, so you don't have to have these exceptions to track them for residency purposes. There is, and it seems rather odd that this is part of the Veterans Choice Act. That's just the way they passed this. I think it was 3 years ago. There are some very limited scenarios where someone, if the service member is on active duty and not a resident and not stationed here, the student may be eligible. Again, it's tied to a benefit. A couple cases I know of is, for example, the service member had been in the military, was discharged, and sometime later went back into active duty. They were claiming a state other than North Carolina as their home, and the service member was stationed in Virginia. So there's no tie right now to North Carolina. But because the person had been discharged and from the previous service had an award that was available to the student, they're eligible. So in a case like that, and they tell us we have that flag that we'll do, you shouldn't see many of these, but with all of these, with veterans, what I would say is if the VA awards them, go with it. They're the ones that basically decide who's going to be eligible. If there's no, and the VA has confirmed to us, by the way, that unless state law makes a blanket provision, which it doesn't, there's no adjustment of tuition if the student's not using it. So these students need to be tracked by your financial aid folks to see that, when the benefit's used up, that they aren't continuing to get that in-state rate unless they come back to RDS to qualify. In theory, they should be in the process of doing that. Okay, so there are carved into law, and these are actually in a separate statute for community colleges, some other provisions. UNC has two of their own. There are several more for the community colleges. I'm going to give you a quick high-level view. These are, because some of these get really, really detailed. I could spend a whole session on these if there's interest. But what you need, the documents you need or whatnot is spelled out in that campus manual. Most of you probably are familiar with the business-sponsored students. So what this provision allows for is a student who is classified as a non-resident, if a North Carolina employer agrees to and pays 100% of the bill for the semester directly to the college, it's considered as, okay, well, really they're sending them for training or something. This does not work for, well, they're going to reimburse me or they're going to give me 500 toward or whatever. No. So that has to be, you need to look at your internal procedures of how you're going to follow up with that. It varies by campus, but usually the employer provides something in writing. That's only able to be granted for any semester they do that. If they say we're going to do it for one semester or two and that's it, the exception can't be extended. This is the only exception, other than a military thing, which active duty. This is the only exception where you could consider giving this to someone who, let's say, is DACA or does not currently have an eligible immigration status, if the person is sending them for training. Okay. Secondly is business and military sponsored. Okay, well, if they're active duty military, there's a provision. There's talk about families that got transferred. This might apply to civilian employees where the position was moved to one military installation to another. But basically, you have a scenario where, let's say, a parent of one of your students works for Bank of America in Virginia. They have been transferred to North Carolina. Okay, and the business will put that in writing that they transfer them. Basically, most of these exceptions are meant to help someone meet the duration. So this person still has to have a legal status. They still have to be residing in North Carolina. They just haven't met the 12-month duration yet. It's meant to help them with that. Okay. This is also restricted in that you're only allowed to give that to 1%, can't exceed 1% of your out-of-state enrollment at your college. That can be rounded up. So if you end up with 1.6% of our students are out of state, you can round that up to 2. So in other words, 2 students. And again, it's not meant to be forever. It's meant to be, they're supposed to be living here and establishing residency. But again, they've got to be U.S. citizen or hold an eligible status. The nonprofit one here, they must also be living in North Carolina, okay, and they must have been lawfully admitted for the non-citizens. I'm going to mention here, because it applies to a couple of others, when we talk about students who are lawfully admitted, there is one restriction in federal law about students attending, and that's that they have an active B-type visa, which is basically visitors, or they're here temporarily on business. They're not allowed to enroll in a curriculum program. Other than that, now, if they had one that's long expired, there's another picture immigration-wise, they're okay. But you can't use a B visa. This is where this gets really into the weeds. I encourage you to look at the manual when you have any of these and/or give a call. Certain non-US citizen public high school graduates, okay, same thing. They have to be residing in North Carolina. They did not present evidence of a current eligible status to RDS. Maybe they'll qualify in time. It depends on what their scenario is. But again, you've got to look for that lawful admission, and the manual will help you in terms of what forms they would have if they were lawfully admitted. Refugees. This one is causing a lot of confusion today because people use that term in a generic popular sense, and it's not how immigration defines them. This only applies to people who truly have a classification of refugee by immigration. I'm getting a lot of questions, especially from universities, about people who have arrived from Afghanistan, the Ukraine, saying, well, they're refugees, and how come, refugees in eligible status, they were not admitted as refugees. So we have to go by the definition that immigration uses and whether it permits establishing a residence. So these are truly refugees. Refugees are eligible in RDS, guidelines. However, this again would be someone who has arrived, but they haven't been here 12 months. So again, it's just going to help you with duration. So U.S. non-citizen who has applied for immigrant permanent resident status. And I know some of these gets complicated. Sorry, I didn't write these. An applicant, this is someone who, in the majority of the time, has had another immigration status. It's rare cases they wouldn't. You can't just, your first stop is almost never. I'll give you an almost never. It depends on some family situations sometimes, with marriage and so forth, or with children. But your first stop is not a green card. These are people who have applied for a green card. Well, that petition, if it's approved, RDS will take that. These are people who have just submitted it. And depending on their path, it might go very quickly and they'll get one, and the petition comes back approved. We'll go ahead and approve them. They don't have to have that green card in hand. That can take them months to get all the appointments for biometrics and get the actual card. These are people who have applied for it. Usually we don't take, I've applied for something, because there's no guarantee you're going to get it. But there is a provision, again, if they were lawfully admitted and if they're living in North Carolina, in this case, they had to have been living here already 12 months. I know this gets very complicated. I didn't write the laws, so we just have to interpret them and follow them. So if they've been living here 12 months. Now, if that student, here's where if you work with RDS, if that student has another status and they're trying to, if you will, upgrade that to a permanent resident, we can look at the other status. It may be eligible. So that would be an exception, but you'd have to track them to see if they get approved or denied. Federal law enforcement officers, you probably won't get many of these that get transcribed by the federal government to a workstation in North Carolina. There's some guidance in there, but basically they're going to get, an immediate waiver for that status if you verify it. This is the new one in the last year. Certain U.S. citizen, North Carolina public high school graduates. So a provision was passed with a lot of limitations from the legislature that if you have a US citizen who, for whatever reason, is not passing through RDS, you can give a waiver if they graduated from a public high school within 12 months of their graduation date. So 12 months only. And all these exceptions, these last 2 pages, by the way, are only good at a community college, just so you know. I mean, they're specifically, the community college has advocated for them at some point. Some of these date back, some are more recent, and UNC's will not. They have 2 of their own. And that leads me to the final one here, is that there is one of the 2 UNC system exceptions has to do with UNC full-time employees. So it was determined that there was nothing in there to preclude the community colleges from recognizing it, but you need to follow the rules in their law of what the requirements are. So we get students trying to come through, for example, who are work study or a graduate assistant. Those are not eligible full-time employees. And UNC has a lot of affiliate, like health clinics and things like that. Those are not eligible by their definition. It must be a regular full-time employee of a UNC institution, or there are some other hospitals that are teaching hospitals that are on the list that they will accept. The others are not eligible. And so what they require for UNC system is getting a letter from HR that the person has an eligible position. And again, they have to be living in North Carolina, and they just haven't met the 12-month duration. So one thing I'd caution you in these exceptions is, because we've had a couple of cases already where one campus, saw one and said, well, doc is eligible. Another one said, no, they're not. Or like, this employee's eligible, and the other one said, no, they're not. And then the, parents start complaining. So be careful about the requirements in law for these. So you've got to look at the eligibility. If it says 1 semester, it's 1 semester. If it's 2 or whatever, you have to keep renewing. That's going to be a campus responsibility, because we don't know who's granting exceptions, and it's got to be handled by the campus, or who's enrolled or what. Especially after a year, you can always encourage a student come back for a new determination, because they might meet residency criteria and you won't have to do these exceptions and tracking. And for many students, it might open up eligibility for state grants. I want to talk about the grace period. So I mentioned this earlier, that there's a provision in statute that the student has to have already been admitted and attending who got in-state, and you find out there's been a change in circumstances, they tell you, or we're going to look at tracking in a minute, their visa expired and they don't have a renewed visa yet. You can put them on a grace period working with RDS, okay, which we have to do because there's grant implications for some students, so you don't want to get into a situation where there's been an overpayment. So there can be a tuition extension once that's set up, and there's details in there how to do that. There's also another provision for a student or a family that moves out of state. They might even change their license, everything else, and decide this isn't working out. I thought this was a dream destination and I don't like the job market and I'm going back. If they return within 12 months, as long as they can show they have started to reestablish a residence and change things back, that 12-month duration would be waived. If they wait 2-3 years, that's not going to help them. And again, RDS can help coordinate that and can verify things online about have they really started reestablishing. So the statutory grace period applies only for the and for the residency. It does not apply to any exception. So if you make an exception, for example, like that UNC exception or North Carolina employer, if the student loses eligibility, then they've lost eligibility for tuition. They're not eligible for a grace period only if they were truly in-state residents. Okay. These get complicated, so what I would encourage you to do is when you have one of those questions come up, look at that campus guide and/or give us a call. Tracking. By the way, I know I'm rushing through this. I want to make sure I get to the end where I give you plenty of time to ask questions. So there's two types of things you would track. One of them is, of course, any campus-based tuition exceptions that have a time limit. You need to see that they're still eligible. You know, is that employer paying 100% directly for the student still, or was that only for 1 or 2 semesters? Same thing with like veterans. There are just a couple of scenarios where the residency, you know, the RDS has made a determination and you need to track. These get a flag for tracking, right? And other than the military, and those are long-term tracking, again, as long as they're continuously enrolled, I wouldn't worry about it. Once they stop out after a year or they graduate, at that point, they need to be reevaluated. It's really just time-limited immigration statuses. Probably most of your non-citizens are going to have a permanent status, you know, such as a green card, but a permanent resident, asylee, refugee, conditional permanent resident, they have no expiration of status. Their card may, but that's largely to combat fraud. The old cards, which are still valid if they have them, were for life unless you ask for a new one. So they don't need tracking. But some visas and temporary protected status categories, there's no guarantee they're going to be renewed long term. So what RDS does in these is they will pass on the expiration date of that document and flag it with a code that says not immigrant tracked. So you should be able to pull up a query to see what students and what dates are coming up. And there's where if a student has not renewed it, you can look at a grace period. If they have, you have 2 options. You can collect the documentation and note it if they're continuously enrolled, or you could choose to send them to RDS if you'd rather not deal with sorting out all the immigration forms. Okay, so those are the cases that need to be tracked. As I say, the active duty and all that is long-term if they stop out or graduate. So again, active duty, as long as they're continuously enrolled the same program. So if they graduate or stop out, you need to, we need a new determination. Again, if they have NN, that's not an exception. If they were a resident to begin with, just because they're military, you don't need to track them. Same thing with non-resident National Guard. Almost all of them are. They're getting NN. So these are the rare exception. Again, it would be flagged with an NCNG code for you to know, but and those contracts are long-term. Initially, it's like 7 years. Sometimes renewals are 3 years. You know, so yeah, it's you won't see many of these. Very rare. Veterans, whatever your workflow is in your campus, of whoever works with veterans benefits and assigning that, you need to have a workflow that looks at ensuring that the student has an award and is using it, or any term you give an exception. So you shouldn't leave this open-ended, you know, like for the rest of their career. Again, if they can have an award but say I don't want to use it, or they've exhausted it, there's no tuition exception. They can always return. UNC employee, what they require in the UNC system is verification each term that the employee's still employed in an eligible position. Again, after 12 months, because they're supposed to be establishing residency, you know, that's what they do. Is like, if you haven't done that in 12 months, then you're not eligible anymore. Ignore that last one. I just did something for UNCs and I talked about their full scholarship. Statutory grace period, again, you need to work with RDS on these. The grace period is calculated on the date of the change. So if they come in today and say, I need to change our address on file because we've all just moved to Virginia, and they tell you they moved June 1st, the clock starts June 1st, not today, for that 12 months. It's the date of that. And that gives them an opportunity to either try to establish something on their own merit, or, you know, recognize and plan for they're going to get charged out of state, or try to establish residency in the other state. Time limit of immigration, again, you know, you're going to have that flag. This is only for temporary visa holders and temporary protected status. That code, who got in, and you will have a tracking date. There is unfortunately a delay in the visa renewal process, and it depends really on their scenario. Is if the student is the one that has it directly, and not an umbrella from a parent like an H-1B, those go much faster. If it's an H-4 dependent of an H-1B, they're not permitted to work, and so those are seen as not the priority to rush through. So when they see, usually they've got a couple of years there. If they wait till 3 weeks before it's expiring, they're not going to get a renewal back that quickly. So you can use that grace period. And again, you could either handle that at the campus if they're expiring while they're enrolled, or send them back to RDS, whichever. We can take a look. Finally, there's something in there about tuition waivers. I'm not going to go into detail other than to say, whatever the requirements are for that, you know, you've got to meet. However, almost all of them require they be a North Carolina resident. So that's why we mentioned in our guidebook is, for example, a ward of the state of North Carolina. The person has turned 18, but we use that because we look at, okay, well, we're not looking for a parent, so they're here and verifying they're still here, they're eligible. However, whatever steps you need to go through to document that for the tuition waiver still is in place and not an RDS issue. In the guidebook, there's codes explained. Sometimes I get questioned about the category codes, the path they used coming through, but the other are informational or exception, like that veterans exception or that non-immigrant visa tracking. Those are flags we put on there for your information. And I've talked about this already. There's copies coming to you along with today's presentation of the official guides. In addition, if you don't have it or have them, there are 2 documents, I believe, in the community college system repository that deal with the colleague side of this, of, you know, routine processes and maintenance and troubleshooting when you get a determination that's stuck in there that says request pending. People think it's at the RDS side. It's not. It's pending in colleague. So that gives you some guidance on a colleague question. And I think, you know, I'm just sending these out again. They're also in that campus guide. Contact numbers for the public, student helpline. They can always call and ask a lot of times we get calls from the student isn't sure what document you want. I mean, they can see it in their termination desk board. They could also call in. And then the one for campus staff, please just reserve this to campus staff. Because if you're calling in, we want you to be able to get through when you have a student in front of us and not go through the call center. And then finally, my contact information. So my role is we provide oversight of RDS, but provide guidance of the laws and policies, helping provide guidance on any campus-based exceptions, responsibilities, and then publishing the works. So that was our World One tour. I want to see what questions we have on this or other related issues.
You have none in a chat box right now, but I think you said on other issues also. So I'm assuming if they have questions about anything other than this presentation, they can still ask that also, I guess.
Sure.
Okay.
Jean and Monty, this is Michelle. How are you?
Hi, Michelle. We're good.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good. So we had a situation come up and I'm just trying to understand what we need to do. In order for the in-state qualified veteran, for someone who's using veteran benefits, part of the stipulation is that they sign a letter of intent saying that they plan to establish residency in North Carolina. Student signs that letter of intent, they leave. and come back, they're still technically considered an out-of-state resident when they complete their RDS, but they are using veteran benefits. So we are going to award them, again, an in-state qualified veteran waiver. Why are we requiring them to do a letter of intent? Is that necessary? Do we have to maintain that?
Let me respond. That's not our requirement. That's the VA's requirement. So on cases like that, I guess I would consult with them about saying, hey, in this case, the person did this, they came back. I don't know how they treat that. Does the clock start over again? Because they were here and then they left and came back? But that's their requirement. And that's why, in theory, these shouldn't go on long-term, because they're attesting to the VA that they're in the process of establishing a residence here.
So then how do we handle that in those situations? I mean, they're
Again, I
using
would
their
ask them. It's their law, it's their requirement. I can't answer it for them. Is they require that, and they require the student to attest to that and follow through. At what point are there provisions of how they? You would have to ask them. Again, that's under VA federal law. It's nothing to do with state law or RDS. I think you have to refer that to your VA folks.
So would that have any RDS impact? I think, that intent.
Well, to me, it goes back to, if you're looking at meeting the requirements, you're saying they were here, they're gone, they've come back. Well, unless they've been back at least a year, I don't think they're going to meet our criteria, because you have to meet 12 months uninterrupted of a domicile. We can look at that. But in terms of granting the exception again, I think you got to talk to VA, because that's their law and their requirement and not a state law. But for RDS purposes, I mean, we can always take another look. But if you're saying they left and came back, that leads me to believe they're probably not going to meet requirements here, but they can always come back and see.
So then you're telling me I have to contact VA to find out if the student qualifies for in-state rates?
Yes. We have nothing to do with that. I mean, that's 100% VA. Every time I've communicated with them, they always say, unless you have a state law that's providing a blanket provision, which we don't. Whatever is in, it's the same thing where they decide what chapters are eligible, or whether someone has an assigned benefit, or all of that. If they award, they award. If they don't, they don't. Now, if you have concerns about whether or not they're still eligible because of the statement, the affidavit they fill out, I think you've got to address it to them, because I mean, that's not in our purview. That's theirs.
So it's more about them saying the clock is stopped ticking, and then and as far as the 12-month period, that's what it impacts.
Okay. Well, again, we got to separate out here residency versus tuition exception. They have to define the tuition exception. It is in federal law under the VA's control purview.
Right, got you.
We can't do that. How will we treat that in terms of residency for the state law here? If they'd have to show that they were here at least 12 months uninterrupted and change things. Now, we could review it. I mean, if you're talking about they were here, they were attending, they left, and they came back, what's the time frame? If it was within 12 months, and they've changed things back and there's enough to justify it, they might qualify for residency here. But we have to separate the residency piece from the VA exception piece.
Right.
And I'm not asking about the residency piece. I'm asking about the exception piece.
And again, that we have nothing to do with that. Zero. That's the VA's definition in federal law, and they administer that. Like, we have nothing to do with who gets awarded or what chapters are awarded. That's all in federal law under the VA's purview.
Okay, I think I have 3 more, unless okay. Michelle, if you have any follow-up, just come back around if you think of anything else.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, one thing is, how do you pull in RDS for students for a student that does not have a social security number? Let me reread that because I stumbled all around it. How do you pull in RDS for a student that does not have a social security number?
That's going to be something you got to look at in your college system. The student can come through without one, so long as they give a unique identifier. If they give a TIN or a immigration number, if they have that, they can use that. Or if they have the state high school ID number. So for your non-citizens, if they're not working, they probably don't have a social security number if they don't have a work permit. So maybe the parent does, but they don't. So that's something you're going to have to look at the colleague level. Monty, I don't know if you have any insights or anybody else here does how they do it, but they have to have a unique identifier. We give them options. So a student like that won't get validated unless they're validating on the parents. But how you match that in, we will allow alternate IDs, but they have to provide one of those. I don't know if anybody else in the call can give some insight to what you're doing at your college.
Monty, I asked the question. This is Reba.
Hey, Reba.
Hey, we've been trying to pull that information in for that student for about 2 months now, and it's preventing us from getting him registered for fall classes. So, you know, he's called RDS and he's did a reconsideration, and he's up under his mother's, what is it? A company moved her here.
Okay.
So he's up under that, but that still doesn't qualify him according to what residency sent, you know, what it reads on his. So he already knows that he would be charged out-of-state tuition. It's just that in colleague, we're unable to pull that information in so that it can update that he's out of state so that he can get billed and get registered for classes. So,
Hey, Reba, did you put in a service ticket for Sonia's area to see if they can help you with that?
I didn't, but I would do that. Okay.
Yeah, do
Okay.
that because that's a
I would
college
do
line.
that. I know there are ways, but this gets beyond my expertise. But secondly, I don't want to get into campus procedures, but when it was set up, I mean, we were aware of this, and I know there are ways to pull it in. So Sonia can help.
Yeah, do a service. Yeah, Sonia's great at that. So put in a service ticket.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, anytime. CPCC asks, will we have a training that shows us specific documents and how to read those documentations for these tuition benefits?
If you want one, I can. Honestly, I don't know that you'd remember it a year later when you get some, but we can. I'm happy to do that. The list, the guidebook, the campus guide lists all of the options I could think of in each case of what you would look for to show lawful admission. This is where it gets complex. Some schools that have this once or twice a year, just call me and I'm happy to do it. If you have more or you want that, I'm happy to set something up.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Gene, we get those all the time. And sometimes I'm not sure what I'm looking at, particularly like with you talking about the B visa.
Right.
The visa itself actually has an R and then a B. Is that the B visa? I mean, it would be nice to see some physical documents and discuss the differences between them.
Yeah.
And like,
I'm happy to do some, but I'll tell you, it won't eliminate. I mean, our processing staff deals with these every day, and I still get 2 and 3 calls a week about, I can't figure this one out. I mean, the problem is there's so many, it's not always straightforward, and there are variations on the theme, and sometimes you get alternate visa forms, and it's not easy. But I'm happy to do that, you know, in terms of at least it may help with some of them, what to look for.
I know, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, and obviously you're going to have a lot more than some community colleges.
All right, thank you. Next, good afternoon. I had a student who was granted the campus level exception for a military spouse. However, spouse was reassigned. She has been continuously enrolled but changed her major for fall 22. We do not apply the campus level exception for fall 22 because she changed her major. Is this correct? Anything we can do if her previous major was in health related, and she is not able to do clinicals virtually.
Right. I would say, did you treat this student as a new admission or just change of major?
Almira.
Change in major. I would see that as they're continuously enrolled because you didn't have a readmit situation. And a change of major, I would say they're still eligible because it's the same degree. I mean, it's an associate degree at the same level. I would give them the benefit of the doubt on that. It's the person who's stopped out. I would link it to admission. If you're requiring a readmission because they graduated or they were out more than a year, at that point, I think we have to look at it.
So program means associate degree, but not major.
Honestly, the way it's worded, I think it's a matter of interpretation. What I would suggest, and I've suggested to colleges and universities, is do you handle it as a change of major, or are you considering a whole new program? Now, if someone goes like Con Ed, the curriculum, I mean, to me, that's, you know, a big change. But if you're considering that they're continuously enrolled in a curriculum program, I'd probably go ahead and let them continue.
The continuous enrollment stuff stated on page 35 of the campus responsibility document says that continuous enrollment is defined as a student who's enrolled at the same college or university program in consecutive semesters. I'm sorry, students maintain continuous enrollment in the same program.
So I guess to my mind, if you're in an associate arts program and you're changing, or an AAS program or whatever, from one major to the other, I see that as the same program. I think the intent behind all these discussions early on was someone, for example, who finishes a degree and they're looking to transfer or enter another degree level. The idea is that they've given them some leeway to continue their studies, but like, for example, the student who finishes associate degree or finishes the bachelor's degree, that they're not going on to seek another degree. I would link it to admission.
But we don't require people who graduate from one degree going to another degree to fill out a new application. They can do a program change.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll leave that up to you all. I think most colleges do, but I mean, I would go back to the graduation. Did they graduate from a program and or stop out?
So it's more about the completion of a program then, and or stopping out.
And or stopping out. That's the way I would look at it. Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jean, I think, any more questions?
I know this is a lot. I think the best advice is, you know, pull that manual out when you start looking at any campus exceptions. Try to be consistent. There were a couple of instances, Monty, I know things came to your attention about one campus saying they were, you know, just going ahead, you know, and awarding, for example, DACA status students certain things, and another one saying, well, we're not, which is right, kind of thing. You got to be consistent because we got legal issues here. But it does get complex, and if you don't deal with some of these things on a regular basis, you know, give a call if we can help. We'll walk you through that.
Okay. All right, I'm checking. No other questions. Michelle, do me a favor, send that to me, that question, just so we can look at it and, you know, in case you need some concrete answers on it.
Okay, yes,
Say again?
I will. Thank you.
Okay, but to James' point, I guess it's either completion of a program or stopping out for more than a year. 12 months. I won't say a year, 12 months. So, but we can bring that up to HECAC and which is the governing body, and, you know, JW can look at it and we can have that conversation. So, with that being said, no other questions. Thank you all for being on the call today. Jean, thank you so much for your expertise and your guidance. And I will stop the recording now in case someone has some questions beyond now.